housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time has almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red, and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of the speaking order, we will begin with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority, and finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any one of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. And with that, I want to acknowledge Ranking Member Cole and all of our colleagues for joining this morning. And I thank you to our witnesses, Dr. Kessler, Dr. Pace, Dr. Disbrow, for speaking with us on our nation's role in global COVID-19 vaccine equity. Let me just start by saying that I am disturbed. I am disturbed by the general lack of urgency in ensuring that every person across the world has access to the COVID-19 vaccine. This pandemic has already sickened 250 million people and claimed more than 5 million lives across the globe. People are dying every day, and yet little progress has been made to deliver more vaccines to the countries that are being left behind. Even as many of us in the United States are receiving booster shots, fewer than 5% of people in low-income countries have received a single dose. By some estimates, many people in low-income nations will not have access to a vaccination until 2023 without significant increases in worldwide vaccine production and distribution. I do sincerely appreciate the work that the Biden administration has done. After all, this administration has been delivering vaccine dosage abroad since June. And so far, the United States has donated more vaccines than all other countries combined. It is also encouraging that President Biden has pledged to donate at least 1.1 billion doses of vaccine by the end of next year, while calling for 70% vaccination in all countries by fall 2022. I'm particularly proud of the work that my friend Dr. David Kessler, who joins us here today, has done both during this pandemic and for many years as former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration and under the leadership of 3 American presidents. I welcome his testimony and I applaud his commitment to the health and the safety of the people. I just might add here that I was pleased, Dr. Kessler, to hear the administration's announcement today of a new initiative to invest in domestic vaccine production to increase vaccine by 1 billion doses per year. That's the kind of effort we're looking for, but also wanting to hear is how we're going to accomplish that and how we are going to oversee that distribution as well. I also want to note the important role that BARDA has played during this pandemic, working extensively to scale up production of everything from PPE and at-home tests to vaccine and therapeutic treatments. I'm also grateful that BARDA has used funds provided by Congress to work with COVID vaccine manufacturers such as Moderna, and that it was BARDA's many years of support for mRNA, the platform technology, along with decades of basic research at the NIH that enabled Moderna to produce the COVID-19 vaccine. And I want to commend the efforts of Dr. Pace, whose Office of Global Health will be instrumental along with USAID and CDC, in addressing vaccine equity efforts on the ground. But on the other hand, it is shocking to me that we have not received full and unfettered cooperation from all of our partners in this effort, including the private companies such as Moderna, making billions of dollars from US taxpayers. The fact of the matter is, every day that low-income countries remain vulnerable to COVID-19 is another day for the virus to mutate and to adapt. And if we fail to ensure their access to vaccines, those countries will become the breeding grounds for new variants, variants that may be more transmissible or even worse, vaccine resistant. I will be blunt. I don't believe we are moving fast enough. Unless we take a more active role in significantly increasing vaccine production and accelerating distribution worldwide, sharing technology and expertise, and scaling up health system capacity and strengthening multilateral institutions, we are essentially shooting ourselves in the foot, putting ourselves collectively at the risk of a fifth, sixth, or seventh wave. We absolutely need to accelerate the production of COVID vaccine by any means necessary, including by invoking any legal authorities at our disposal to compel these vaccine companies to work with partners in the US and throughout the world. Quite frankly, it is not just our moral imperative to ensure the health and safety of our friends across the globe, it is in our own self-interest. While the United States, as I noted earlier, has donated more vaccines than all other countries combined and has become a powerful leader in the fight to vaccinate the world, why is it taking so long to manufacture the vaccine? Why are we as a nation being held captive by a botched Trump administration contract, one that allowed Moderna to ignore the involvement of the NIH and benefit from millions of dollars in taxpayer funds? Just this week, it was announced that Moderna is close to making an agreement to pledge doses to low and middle income countries in 2022. This is a positive step forward, but not enough. For the life of me, I cannot understand why we are beholden to this company. People are dying. Time is of the essence. And in the midst of it all, Moderna is making billions of dollars, controlling vaccine production and negotiations of a life-saving vaccine that HHS helped them to create. This is unacceptable. NIH and BARDA must be aggressive in protecting and asserting legal rights to their work. This administration must be aggressive in pursuing every option to work around that botched contract and to use every tool at its disposal to accelerate vaccine production, including the Defense Production Act. And President Biden must be aggressive in compelling other countries to back the TRIPS waiver, which would allow more countries to manufacture more COVID-19 vaccines. When the World Trade Organization meets later this month for its 12th ministerial conference, I will be watching closely to ensure the proposal on temporarily waiving some intellectual property rights rules under the TRIPS agreement is accepted. I know these are serious and they are complex issues that cannot be easily resolved, but I also know that failure is simply not an option. This pandemic will not be over until it is over around the world. I hope that through this hearing, we can gain some clarity as to why we are not moving fast enough, why we are enabling a system that allows pharmaceutical companies like Moderna to profit off of global suffering, and how exactly we plan to vaccinate 8 billion people as soon as humanly possible. With that, let me turn to my good friend from Oklahoma, the ranking member of the committee, Congressman Tom Cole, for any opening remarks that he may have.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And just before my remarks, a quick housekeeping piece of advice to you as you preside over. I may have to leave at some point because of my duties on rules, so I might not be here at the end, but I certainly am going to stay for as much as possible. Madam Chair, the United States investments in biomedical research and medical countermeasures have paved the way for the fastest vaccine ever developed in our nation's history. These strategic investments, led by with federal support, have also enabled the U.S. to lead the world in vaccine availability. As the president has said, anyone who wants a shot can get one. That's a remarkable achievement, and we are fortunate to be in such a position. I want to thank the thousands of government and private sector employees who work tirelessly to make this reality. Operation Warp Speed, in my mind, remains one of the most undervalued achievements of the last administration. And I want to associate myself, Madam Chair, with your remarks about the role our country is playing in trying to help other less fortunately situated countries get the vaccine as rapidly as possible. I think those are worthy goals and important questions need to be raised and answered. And I know we're here today to discuss the United States, what the United States government can do to bolster global supply of coronavirus vaccines. But before we delve into that topic, I want to spend a few minutes on a fact that I find deeply troubling. The Build Back Better legislation introduced in the House contains just $3 billion for pandemic preparedness. That's less than 0.2% of the total. Let's pause and think about that. Nearly $2 trillion in spending and just 1.7%, that is just less than 1/5 of a percent, is dedicated to preparing for the next pandemic. Of that amount, less than half is dedicated to funding for public health and preparedness research, development, and countermeasures capacity. Such a de minimis amount dedicated to so critical a function should be unacceptable to everyone. I've said multiple times that you're far more likely to die from a pandemic than a terrorist attack, and sadly, the results of the last 2 years have shown how devastatingly true that is. I would hope the majority's flagship effort to build a better tomorrow after a global pandemic that shook the world would recognize the need to invest in a substantial way in biomedical and biodefense research enterprise. I find this omission another sign of short-sightedness that we see throughout the legislation with short-term extensions and unreasonable policies that most Americans do not support. I also want to acknowledge, however, that the chair's mark contains 6 times as much funding compared to the Build Back Better bill, and that's with nearly 7 times less money. Now, while I still believe we need to invest more in biodefense infrastructure, I am pleased to see the levels proposed in the chair's fiscal year 2022 appropriations for this subcommittee. I know our chair strongly supports access to child care, improving our nation's schools, and paving a way to affordable higher education for all children. She also recognizes, in addition to human infrastructure investments, that we cannot neglect the biomedical and biodefense infrastructure. She supported these programs in her mark, and I hope she sustains that level of support going forward. We have always found these areas of agreement to serve as the basis for our partnership for 6 years running. I also want to recognize that in her annual funding bill, she's proposing nearly the same amount of funding as what was put forward in the Build Back Better bill, which covers up to 10 years. I think this fact shows this subcommittee, possibly more than any other, understands how important these programs are. Underinvestment here ensures the nation will be less prepared for the next outbreak. I led with the importance of the continuing investment in biomedical research and programs like BARDA because it was past funding that enabled the United States to be the current leader by far in global COVID vaccination donations. The U.S. has donated and delivered more than 235 million doses of COVID vaccines to more than 100 countries. And I'm pleased at the even more aggressive plans that the administration has unveiled in recent days. In addition to efforts by the federal government, vaccine manufacturers have also made commitments to increase production and availability to ensure vaccination becomes a global reality. As proud as I am of our nation leading the way, the United States should not have the sole responsibility for vaccinating the global population. It's a shared problem and a shared responsibility. In addition, in my opinion, the Department of Health and Human Services should not be responsible for vaccinations abroad. I understand the agency may have a supporting role to the Department of State and USAID, but events over the last 18 months have shown that we have enough challenges domestically for HHS to focus on. It should not try to achieve objectives beyond its responsibility and capability. I'd like to end by noting that now is the time for us to be looking at opportunities for the next generation of vaccine technology, development of new therapeutics, and more affordable diagnostics. I know some of those efforts are underway, but too much focus has been given to the continuing of the status quo. If we continue that approach, we will not achieve global vaccination for years to come. We need to look to new technologies to achieve our goal and should not be neglecting those investments now. I also think we need to expand our focus to future threats. Now is the best time to leverage what we've learned about COVID to begin research into new countermeasures and potential pathogens. We know that the devastation that can be caused by a new virus. We need to do a better job to identify future threats on the horizon and work on mitigation now. Waiting for the next virus to strike and hoping it's far into the future is foolish. The more we shortchange our preparedness today, the less prepared we are when what may be just around the corner. I want to thank our witnesses for their time today. I look forward very much to their testimony. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back my time.
Thank you very, very much. And now what I'd like to do is to turn to our witnesses. Dr. David Kessler, who is the Chief Science Officer of COVID-19, the COVID-19 response. Ms. Lois Pace, Director, Office of Global Affairs, the Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Gary Disbrow, Director, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, the Department of Health and Human Services. Our first witness is Dr. David Kessler. Your full written testimony will be included in the record, Dr. Kessler. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement, and welcome to the committee.
Thank you so much, Chair DeLauro. Chair DeLauro, Ranking Member Cole, distinguished members of the committee. I am David Kessler. I'm honored to be serving as Chief Science Officer for the COVID-19 response. Thank you for having me here today and for the opportunity to testify before you. I have the great privilege of working closely with my colleagues from the Department of Health and Human Services, Director Pace, Dr. Disbrow, who are also appearing before you today. The United States by far is leading the effort to vaccinate the world. We have proudly donated more doses than all other countries combined. We will continue and must continue to donate more and more doses. Currently, we're donating 1.2 billion doses to the world. This includes the US government's groundbreaking deal to deliver 1 billion donated doses of Pfizer vaccine to countries in need through COVAX. As of today, 250 million donated doses have been shipped to 108 countries. For every one shot we have put in the arm of an American, we are donating about 3 shots globally. Because of what you have allowed HHS and USAID to do, we are spending over $11 billion on global vaccine supply. And we continue to encourage our international partners to share more doses and expedite the delivery of those already committed. Today, we are announcing that to meet short and long-term needs, both domestically and globally, the United States government is seeking to enter into an historic partnership with one or more experienced pharmaceutical manufacturers to increase mRNA vaccine US-based production capacity for domestic and global use by at least 1 billion doses annually, not later than the second half of 2022. This will allow us to address the current COVID-19 pandemic and prepare for future pandemic response efforts. I want to be clear that I personally continue to engage vaccine manufacturers to increase production and availability of vaccines for low and middle income countries. Chair DeLauro, we share your urgency and the passion to make sure that we are the leader in making available vaccines for low and middle income countries. As part of those conversations, we negotiated a deal with Moderna and the African Union, where the United States defers deliveries of 33 million doses, allowing the AU to buy up to 110 million Moderna vaccines at a reduced rate negotiated by the United States. We also broke through a logjam and brokered a deal between Moderna and COVAX, enabling the two parties to reach an agreement where COVAX will purchase to date 56 million doses of Moderna vaccine. Moderna is also retroactively discounting doses already sold to COVAX, all because of the United States government's intervention. We have told Moderna that we expect them to help fill the remaining COVAX shortfall. We expect that the number of doses that Moderna will make available to COVAX will increase in the next few weeks. Let me tell you about another step that we took that I think is a first. The United States government brokered an historic deal with J&J and COVAX to facilitate the first ever delivery of COVID-19 vaccines to people in conflict zones and other humanitarian settings that cannot be reached by government vaccination campaigns. The USG and COVAX worked with J&J to waive liability for doses, pioneering a novel legal approach that will allow COVAX to give donated doses to NGOs to administer to people in these conflict zones and other humanitarian settings. The U.S. also negotiated a path-breaking deal to make 300,000 doses of J&J available to humanitarian workers around the world. As the Biden administration continues this critical work, we also need the world to do more. We need every other country to step up against this virus like the United States is doing. Thank you very much, Chair DeLauro. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Kessler. And our next witness is Dr. Lois Pace. Your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, good morning, distinguished members of the subcommittee. We've seen the numbers. COVID has caused more than 5 million deaths worldwide, more than half of these in low and middle income countries. Vaccination rates in some of these countries are in the single digits. Less than 10% of the population of Africa is vaccinated, compared to more than 50% in North America and Europe. We know this is unacceptable. So I want to thank you, Chairwoman DeLauro, Ranking Member Cole, and your esteemed colleagues for convening us today to talk about global vaccine equity and the role our government should play in driving that. Now, 2 things I want to say up front. One, this isn't only up to us. It's going to take actors from all over the world, government officials, industry leaders, community organizations, philanthropists, and others to make this happen. This is why the President convened those very stakeholders this fall and called on them to fulfill their promises and help close the global access gap. He issued this challenge not only for vaccines, but also for treatments, tests, and critical supplies. Number 2, the U.S. is doing its part, playing a lead role and practicing what we preach. At this point, we've donated close to 250 million vaccines to more than 100 countries around the world, both directly and through partners like COVAX, CARICOM, and the African Union. That's millions of people protected from this virus, thanks to our commitments and action. We've engaged governments and companies in Asia and Africa to expand manufacturing in those regions, and also call for voluntary technology transfer to facilitate those efforts. Of course, the world needs more, which is why our work continues. We are not letting up. Those of us in the center of this work know what's at stake if we don't follow through. Not only could we face the constant threat of COVID, but we could continue to burden our health workforce, supply chains, and overall society with an ongoing and seemingly never-ending pandemic. Not only are our efforts practical, they're personal. We read the same headlines you do, and we hear those accounts ourselves every day. Many of us have lived and worked in countries still lacking what they need. Some of us have friends and family there, managing an unsettling reality and all too common story of persistent health disparities. HHS staff take calls from colleagues around the world, partners with whom we've worked for years, describing what life is like without access to vaccines. Those are tough conversations, recognizing how great the demand is worldwide, but they're easier when we can offer help, and we do. Our staff meet with ministries of health about their national vaccination campaigns and how to maximize the supply they receive. We've engaged foreign regulators and researchers so that more product comes to market when and where it's needed. And we've worked with policymakers from Africa to Asia to Latin America and the Caribbean on real-time responses throughout this crisis, helping to establish or reinforce health surveillance systems and essential services required to succeed. So when Kenya or Mexico needed vaccines, they reached out to us. And when Brazil or India found themselves in crisis, it was the same. Whether working through country-based health attachés, our hundreds of international staff focused on global health security, or contacting the Secretary directly, governments around the world look to HHS for solutions to their public health problems. That's been as true in this pandemic as any other time. Our track record speaks for itself, built on decades of international relationships and programs that have been tested through multiple health crises, like Ebola, Zika, and HIV. We know how to get this right, and we can do this together. It's in the spirit of partnership that's critical to showing up in the world in a way that matters. From day one, the President has talked about the importance of international cooperation as part of our COVID response. Similarly, his administration is committed to using equity as a guiding principle for these efforts. But while ensuring we address health disparities across borders, we must also do so within countries. We know from our own American experience how vital it is that life-saving innovations are available to those who need them. Otherwise, we're all at risk. I want to be able to tell a different story, one that has countries not in the 10th percentile, but meeting our global goal of 70% coverage for COVID vaccines. A world focused on getting back to life rather than fearing another variant or worse. I want us all to feel safe again and to remember this time as a moment when we did right by one another. We have both a strategic imperative and a moral one to deliver what we can, where we can, working to end this pandemic once and for all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next witness is Dr. Gary Disbrow. Your full written testimony will be included in the record. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement. Thank you.
Chairwoman DeLauro, Ranking Member Cole, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on our efforts to develop, manufacture, and procure safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines. I am grateful for the opportunity to address this committee and appreciate your continued support for the ongoing response efforts. I want to start by thanking this committee for the funding and support provided to BARDA over the years and during this pandemic, and the entire BARDA team for their tireless efforts over the last 21 months to develop critical medical countermeasures, or MCMs, to address COVID-19. BARDA continues to play a critical role in the development of vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and other supportive efforts to bring forth these life-saving medical countermeasures. BARDA has invested over $49 billion to develop and procure products to address COVID-19. $33 billion in vaccines, $16 billion in therapeutics, and over $500 million in diagnostics. To date, BARDA has supported the delivery of over 556 million doses of vaccine, and over 443 million doses have been administered. The delivery of over 3.3 million treatment courses of therapeutics and over 168 million diagnostic tests. BARDA has been proactive in engaging with our stakeholder community since the very beginning of the pandemic, to include holding an industry call in January of 2020 with over 1,500 participants. In that same month, BARDA established an MCM portal to act as a single point of entry for parties interested in working with the U.S. government. To date, BARDA has received over 4,500 submissions to the portal, and interagency representatives have met with over 670 companies providing transparent feedback and guidance. BARDA made initial investments to jumpstart the development of MCMs utilizing annual appropriations under Advanced Research and Development and Pandemic Influenza funding. We reviewed our portfolio of partnerships and identified proven technologies that could quickly pivot to develop COVID-19 products. These initial investments and additional investments made once supplemental funds were provided laid the groundwork for the portfolio of products supported under Operation Warp Speed and now the Countermeasure Acceleration Group, or the CAG. The CAG has been able to support development of 1 licensed vaccine, 2 vaccines granted emergency use authorization, 2 vaccines that have positive phase 3 efficacy readouts, and 1 vaccine that is completing a phase 3 efficacy trial. Vaccines are now available for primary series, booster doses, third doses for immunocompromised individuals, adolescents, pediatrics 5 to less than 12 years of age, and studies are ongoing for pediatrics ages 6 months to less than 5 years of age. Development was accomplished in 11 months, providing safe and effective vaccine, and represents the best of what the U.S. government and industry can do when we work together. Moving forward, these unprecedented collaborations will be critical to better prepare the U.S. and the globe for future pandemic threats. BARDA supported the collaboration between Johnson & Johnson and Merck to enhance production capacity announced by the President. BARDA provided funding to Merck to modify one of their manufacturing facilities, a fill-finish facility, and a storage facility to expand domestic production of the J&J vaccine for their international efforts. In addition to the direct support for development of vaccine candidates, BARDA has worked with the International Development Finance Corporation, providing technical expertise for their global investments to expand manufacturing capacity for vaccines. BARDA initiated efforts to expand domestic manufacturing capacity for the critical components that are necessary to support population-scale manufacturing of vaccines. BARDA has been provided $2.6 billion under the American Rescue Plan Defense Production Act to expand capacity for raw materials, consumables, fill-finish capacity, needles and syringes, and vials. Expanding production of these vaccine components is critical to support expanded domestic and global vaccine production. As David mentioned, the administration is committed to donating over 1.2 million doses of vaccine. Under HHS TAG efforts, over 133 million doses have been already donated, and an additional 500 million doses are being donated under the USAID JPO contract. BARDA and JPO are in discussions for an additional 500 million doses of Pfizer vaccine to be purchased at a not-for-profit price for donation. As David mentioned, we recently modified our contract with Moderna to support Moderna's commitment to making vaccine available to the African Union at a not-for-profit price. Thank you again for inviting me to testify before you on efforts within ASPR and BARDA to support the COVID-19 response. I look forward to answering your questions and working with my team at BARDA and our colleagues across HHS and DoD to end the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much for your testimony. We now will move to questions, and I will start with the questions. And I'm just, and the questions, these are a question, Dr. Kessler, and a couple of follow-ups, but all of which I will mention at one time in the interest of time. I'll be frank, and you know that I am. We've dealt with each other before. The irresponsible monopolistic behavior of Moderna is infuriating. Moderna has made billions in profit through an arrangement gifted to the company by the prior administration, by the Trump administration, and the company's refusal to recognize NIH's role in the development of the vaccine. Further, Moderna has refused to cooperate, lend its expertise to partners that could increase production of its vaccine by hundreds of millions of doses. That's unacceptable. So my questions are, why is Moderna able to limit production of a vaccine that U.S. taxpayers spent billions of dollars to develop and manufacture? What is the administration doing to compel the company to increase production as well as distribute the vaccine at a reduced cost to low-income countries? How is the administration going to guarantee that Moderna meets all of its commitments? Should NIH scientists who were involved in the developing Moderna's vaccine be listed on the principal patent application as co-inventors? And should NIH receive co-ownership interest in the vaccine?
Chair DeLauro, the government's position is that mRNA 1273, the Moderna vaccine, was co-invented by government and Moderna scientists. However, Moderna has so far refused to name the government scientists to the principal patent application. Omitting NIH inventors from the principal patent application deprives NIH of co-ownership interest in that application and the patent that will eventually issue from it. With regard to your question about what we have asked Moderna to do and what we expect, we have gone to the extent of actually calling in and discuss this with the chair of the board of Moderna, members of the board, as well as the senior management of Moderna. Very explicitly, we have asked Moderna to do 4 things. 1, We've asked them in the short term, now, not wait quarters from now, but to provide the African Union with doses. To their credit, they have stepped up, and with our colleagues in the African Union, and through the fact that the United States basically deferred our doses so the doses could go to the African Union, that is happening. Number two, we have told Moderna that we expect them to help fill the supply gap with COVAX at not-for-profit prices with significant doses. We will hear, I expect, over the next several weeks, the result of those discussions that are currently underway between Novavax and Moderna. Number three, we have a commitment from Moderna to build a plant, to build manufacturing capacity on the African continent. That is very important to us. Chair DeLauro, you know I chair the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. We have been with you, for 30 years. We've worked on the continent in HIV, and I understand if there is a manufacturing capacity on that continent will not be last in line. It's just that simple. We have Moderna's commitment. We will see what their follow-up is. Lastly, as we testified this morning, we have asked all manufacturers with experience in mRNA to help us expand that capacity for both global and US needs for both pandemic and for COVID, and we would like Moderna's assistance in there. A lot to be done. We are watching closely. President is watching closely. These needs are absolutely essential.
Thank you, and I have just a short period of time remaining, but I need to ask the question: are we the NIH scientists? As you offered at the outset that there was a co-invention. Are we going to have them labeled and listed as principal patent application as the co-inventors, and thereby getting co-ownership interest in the vaccine, which, as you know, opens the door to the U.S. being able to deal with some of these issues. So just, I really want to know, if I can, very, very quickly, what's our guarantee that that is going to happen?
That is the United States government's position, Madam Chair.
Okay, I will get back. I want to be able to guarantee, and you said that we have a way in which we can talk about further of guaranteeing that Moderna meets all of the commitments that it has made. So, thank you. Thank you. And let me now yield to Ranking Member Cole.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dr. Kessler, I just actually have some questions that are informational to help me and hopefully the committee get a better idea of the task in front of us. How much funding remains for the purchase of additional doses for the U.S. population, either booster shots for adults or for children?
Ranking Member Cole, just how much money remains? Can I understand specifically your question?
Yeah, I'm just curious what we may need to do going forward, how quickly we need to do it.
So we have assured adequate supply for boosters for all Americans, and that is also true for adolescents and children. There's obviously, the question beyond that, variants. I'm always try to stay one step ahead of where we are, but the good news is we really, through your help, this should not be understated. Okay, we could not have done what we have done in providing primary vaccines, boosters, adolescents, now school-age children without this committee's help.
Well, you're kind to say that,
and we have done that.
Well, you're kind to say that. I share your opinion. This committee, I think, has done an exceptional job. under our chairman in this regard. How about, let me switch now, how much funding remains for the purchase of, again, international vaccines, which I know you're really focused on? And again, what do we need to look at going forward there to fulfill the commitments that our country has made?
Let me, if I may, Ranking Member Cole, let Director Pace answer that question.
Well,
thanks for this question. It's our understanding that we have the funding available to fulfill the president's commitment of the additional 500 million Pfizer vaccines. Beyond that, additional funds through the American Rescue Plan are being utilized towards vaccine readiness and ensuring those shots get into arms once they're delivered.
Terrific. This may be more appropriate to you, Dr. Pace. I don't know. I'll let you guys decide who's the best person to answer the question. I trust your judgment. I'm curious of what we have committed, how much has been distributed, and I know there's a lot of logistical problems involved in a distribution effort like this. So if you would address that a little bit too, because I know it's going to impact the speed with which you can get what you have out the door, literally.
Of course, I can try to address some of this and then defer to my colleagues. And so with this initial tranche of 500 million of Pfizer doses that's been procured and being distributed by our partners at USAID, we have a 100 million that's gone out. There'll be an additional 100 million, we hope, by the end of this year, and then tracking towards finishing that tranche in the first quarter of next year, followed by the additional 500 million that the president committed at the summit back in September. And I defer to my colleagues for anything I might have missed in that regard for you, Congressman.
Do either of you have additional information you'd like to provide?
Yeah, Ranking Member Cole, this is Gary Disbrow from BARDA. So in addition to the USAID doses that Director Pace mentioned, for vaccine that was purchased by HHS for domestic use, as vaccine supply exceeded the demand, we've also donated over 133 million doses to over 95 countries.
Well, I'll just, I don't have a lot of time, but to number one, just thank all of you for your efforts in this regard. And I would just ask you to keep the committee abreast. I really do worry. We're juggling a lot of balls right now on Capitol Hill and looking forward in funding. This is a stream where I don't think anything should ever be at risk, either in terms of obviously taking care of our people here, but also fulfilling these very important international commitments. We want to make sure that you have the resources that you need in a timely fashion, particularly given some of the logistical problems I think are involved in dealing literally with a global project and conditions that vary very broadly and in many places are very, very difficult. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. And Congresswoman Lee.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you so much for this hearing, and to our ranking member and to all of our witnesses. I think everyone agrees that it's imperative that the United States lead this fight, because we won't be able to end this pandemic, and Americans will continue to be under threat unless we find a way to assist every country in the world to vaccinate their people. And I wanted to focus on the equity issues today. And I guess, Dr. Kessler, you mentioned if there's capacity on the manufacturing capacity on the continent of Africa, that certainly would be welcome and supported. But I think, and I guess maybe Dr. Disbrow, you may be able to answer this in terms of the United States providing the support for the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals on the continent of Africa. I mean, we know that it's going to be, it's a challenge. And so how do we increase vaccine manufacturing on the continent of Africa with using United States leveraging and with the private companies, with the pharmaceuticals? I mean, what could be a plan, or do we have a plan? That's the first question. And then to Director Pace, let me just ask you, with regard to CARICOM countries and the continent of Africa, last time I looked, it was pretty dismal in terms of the Caribbean, in terms of the numbers of vaccine, the percentages that had been distributed on the continent of Africa and in the Caribbean. And so I'd like to find out, and this was about a month ago when I looked at those numbers, it was horrible. And so what is the problem? What's the bottleneck? And are we getting any better with countries where there are, quite frankly, the descendants of Africa? Because once again, we see the inequities in Black and brown countries throughout the world. So I want to know, why in the world are we seeing this when in fact we're investing so much into vaccine production and distribution?
Congresswoman Lee, thank you for that question. I will address your first part of your question. So agreed, and as David mentioned, ensuring that we have a vaccine manufacturing facility on the African continent will make sure that those individuals are not last now and in the next pandemic. As you're aware, BioNTech has made a commitment to building a facility and supporting a facility on the African continent. As Dr. Kessler mentioned, Moderna has also committed to supporting a facility on the African continent. And then we're also working with our colleagues at CEPI and WHO and the Gates Foundation as they want to establish a vaccine hub on the African continent. And what we need to do is, even though this is not funded directly through USG efforts, the funds that have been provided to Moderna and Pfizer to support, through vaccine procurement, actually has provided them the funds to, be able to expand and establish these facilities in Africa. And I think it's important that Gates, CEPI, WHO, and the companies collaborate so that there's a concerted effort to make sure that the vaccine manufacturing facility or facilities that are established in Africa can be sustained in the long run. That is my biggest concern. Everybody is making these, concerted efforts, but we need to make sure it's coordinated so that we can sustain this beyond the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Pace.
Yes, Congresswoman Lee, thank you for your question as well. So with regards to the Caribbean in particular, share your concerns about where they have been in terms of their vaccination. We've been proud to be able to contribute the vaccines that we have. And now we're facing a pivot point, right, where they've received the vaccines, and now we're working closely with them and the Caribbean Public Health Agency and others on readiness and absorption. One of the challenges, honestly, is around demand. The same issue we faced in this country when it came to the distribution of vaccines. The availability and accessibility was there, but we still have to work through community engagement and our longstanding programs to ensure that people really line up for those shots. Similarly, there are some logistical and operational challenges that we're working across the interagency to resolve, particularly with some of these mRNA vaccines, as you're well aware, and some of the cold chain capacity that's required on the ground. And then finally, there's just workforce constraints, particularly as we continue to pull from existing programs, other immunization programs for those vaccinators. And so that presents a challenge as well, not only in CARICOM, but on the African continent in terms of readiness.
So we have the same challenges in the CARICOM countries as we have on the African continent. We have
similar, yes, ma'am.
Africa, on the continent of Africa. We don't have a comparable CDC in the Caribbean. You would think that we'd see better results on the continent of Africa because CDC is cited there.
That's a fair point, Congresswoman, and I appreciate the work that the Africa CDC has done, and yet I think they require additional support from our CDC, from USAID and others, and so we're working hand in glove with them and the Africa Regional Office to resolve those issues as soon as possible and making progress along the way.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And just a quick note with regard to that, it really is about not just the vaccine, but it's about the skills development and the skills training that is required and the technical assistance that required in terms of capacity building. Those are the critical ingredients I think we need to focus on. And I want to thank Congresswoman Lee. Congressman Harris.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for appearing this morning. Dr. Kessler, I have a question. The vaccines, as a background, I think what we're talking about is using last year's technology for this year's problems or for next year's problems. So these vaccines that we're talking about giving to other countries or enabling other countries to get, these are the leaky vaccines. Is that right? I mean, it is pretty clear now that this generation of vaccine that we're talking about sending to other countries are leaky vaccines. People who get the vaccines can get coronavirus. They can get, maybe it's a variant, maybe their immunity wanes. Is that true? Is that clear now?
These vaccines, Congressman, you and I, over our careers, we trained together. At Hopkins, I think we've seen a lot of vaccine development. I have never seen vaccines develop in as short a period of time that are as effective. I mean, these are remarkably, remarkably effective.
But they are not.
No medicine, no therapy is 100% effective. You and I know that.
Sure.
These are remarkably effective. To think that these are
right, but they are not as effective as we had hoped they'd be. I don't think anybody anticipated that we were going to have people get boosters at 6 months, and that it's 6 months. I'm just telling you. I talked to people out in the real world. They were kind of promised that this vaccine was going to be like the other vaccines they've taken. That is, if they've had the disease, they wouldn't have to take the vaccine. If if they got the vaccine, they wouldn't have to get a booster in 6 months. I don't think there's any other vaccine we administer. Is that correct, Dr. Kessler, where you get a booster in 6 months? Is that correct?
You go back to your immunology, our basic immunology courses, right? Remember those, sir? Many of these vaccines, if I may.
Dr. Kessler, I have very limited time. It was a very specific question.
If I can just answer your question.
Is there any other vaccine where you need a booster in 6 months?
There are many vaccines. In fact, majority of vaccines, a lot of vaccines require 3 doses as primary series. So I would ask you to think about.
Dr. Kessler, come on. I'm talking about a boost. And this is important here because we not only have to get the doses to Africa, we have to get boosters to Africa. So let me move on.
Congressman, I think this is very important.
Dr. Kessler, I'm the one who asked the questions here.
I understand, but please, if I may answer the question. This is
Chair, could you please
essential,
direct the witness to let me ask a question of Dr. Disbrow?
Well, yes, and I will allow you to do that.
Count toward my time.
Congressman, no, and I will provide the time. Let Dr. Kessler answer your question. You will have time to ask Dr. Disbrow a question as well. Dr. Kessler.
Madam Chair, excuse me, Madam Chair. Order. I have 5 minutes. I have more questions than Dr. Disbrow. I was going to go back to Dr. Kessler. I need to keep, the witnesses cannot filibuster.
You are raising doubts about the efficacy of this vaccine, and that is wrong, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Let me tell you, I'm a scientist, you're a scientist. Science raises questions about everything.
But it's very important. Okay. You are undermining the confidence of the American people and the world in this vaccine, and that is wrong, sir.
Oh, good. I'm glad you have decided what's right and wrong. Dr. Disbrow, is it true that BARDA did not fund the phase 3 trials for molnupiravir, which looks like it's going to be the breakthrough therapeutic? Is that true?
That is correct, sir.
So despite sending BARDA billions and billions of dollars, the decision was made not to fund a phase 3 trial of a drug that now could be made available to millions of people worldwide who get COVID, even maybe from a leaky vaccine or unvaccinated. So I'm going to come back to Dr. Kessler. What are you doing as the COVID czar to see to it that therapeutics are rapidly advanced as rapidly as possible through the FDA, things like fluvoxamine, very cheap, could be widely available as a second prong approach. We send vaccines and therapeutics to these other countries. So if you could answer about therapeutics.
From day one, therapeutics has been very high on our agenda. We invested $3.2 billion. We are the ones, right, that work with Merck and work with Pfizer. The NIH wrote the protocol for the Pfizer antiviral that now has what we're seeing is very, very important results that are going before the FDA. We are pushing very hard. I would like to work with you, Congressman, right, to make sure once FDA has reviewed these data, right, that antivirals, in addition to vaccines, right, complementing, not substituting for vaccines. Vaccines are still 1, 2, and 3 on the list. But I want to get a safe and effective antiviral accessible to all so we can turn this around. That's what I'd like to work with you on, sir.
Thank you, and I look forward to that. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Congressman Pocan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the witnesses, my apologies for the cult-like fervor to discredit vaccines that some people seem to be obsessed about that could cost American lives. I don't get it, but I'm not a doctor. I'm just a small business owner. So, but I still want to say apologies because it's rather embarrassing to watch this. My questions are specifically around the distribution, and I think these would probably be for either Director Pace or Dr. Disbrow. 4 questions around distribution. 1, cold chain. Had someone who knows quite a bit about this. I believe the country is Zambia, where they're concerned that as the vaccines go to the proper cold storage, they've talked to some of the folks that are the insurers who put little thermometers in with the product, and that they see spikes going to 45 degrees in those cold storage overnight. Concerned about how closely we're watching the cold chain aspects and the consistent deliverable nature of power to these, specifically in some third world countries like Africa. 2, are we putting enough resources into the human distribution of these vaccines? Because that's one issue I've heard that could be another factor in some of these, especially third world countries. 3, are we investing in, by doing this, in some infrastructure so that perhaps whatever we do with this vaccine could turn out to have other positive health ramifications in these countries? And finally, 4, can you talk a bit about the demographic discrepancies? We've seen that in many of these countries, far more men rather than women, and other populations aren't getting the vaccine. What are we doing and try to address that? So I just thought I'd put the 4 questions out there, and whoever wants to answer them, but specifically, I think Director Pace and Dr. Disbrow.
I'm happy
Lois, you want to go first?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Disbrow. I appreciate that. And thank you, Congressman Pocan, for those questions. I want to leave time for my colleague to come in. Briefly, I will say one of the things we're trying to do across the U.S. government is build on existing global health programs and platforms. And so we talk about even leveraging the PEPFAR platform, again, not to put that under constraint, but to utilize the health workforce, supply chain, and other capacity in place in countries to help speed up the rate of COVID vaccination. We're also hopeful, though, to your point, that by adding additional resources or support to these national vaccine campaigns, that they will then sort of survive into the future and be able to address some of these existing global health programs. And so it's a nice cycle, if you will. On the point of reaching women or other special populations and subgroups in particular, we know this from other immunization programs that that's key, and so we're focused on those historically marginalized or vulnerable groups, certainly, in our efforts working with WHO, Africa CDC, or other community-based organizations in particular. I will say one thing about the cold chain support, which is just to say we're factoring that into our readiness analysis, if you will, in ways that we can provide technical assistance, not only through CDC and HHS, but through USAID, DOD, and others. And so it's part of this package of technical assistance that's part of our sort of global vaccination strategy. But it's also why it's critical to think about other vaccines that can come into the picture that don't require the same level of logistics. Dr. Disbrow, please.
Yeah, Director Pace, I think you answered the question very well and completely. I really don't have anything to add.
Can I just follow up then on the cold storage, though, because this was from a very, very reliable source that, you know, in some of this cold storage where the insurance companies actually are gauging the temperatures, because they do for obvious reasons, they're seeing spikes go up to 45 degrees at night. So how do we know, yes, they might have the right cold storage, but how do we know that the vaccine is still secure at that level? Are we doing extra to ensure that either they have adequate power or they're keeping the temperature so that we're not giving a non-useful vaccine to people? Just like to ask that again.
Yeah, so I think it's critically important that, you know, we work with the countries that are receiving the vaccines to make sure that they have ample, not only primary power, but secondary power as well. We had to do this during the 2014-15 outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. We actually sent people over there to make sure that they had, you know, primary power and backup generators, because you have to ensure that the cold chain is maintained to make sure that the vaccine is still effective.
Great. All right, thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Congressman Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank the chairwoman and all of the witnesses for their compelling testimony today, for taking this opportunity to highlight our country's role in the global vaccine distribution effort. We've heard testimony today about the great success of Operation Warp Speed. And I think we ought to really underline success. The previous administration worked diligently with vaccine manufacturers to develop a safe and effective vaccine, and we're still working to administer primary COVID-19 doses and boosters to individuals who voluntarily wish to be immunized. While I think forced vaccine mandates are counterproductive and send the wrong message on immunization, I am happy to note that the domestic production meets current demand in this country. And I think that's something that all of us can be proud of, regardless of our branch, the House, the Senate, or the administration. In regard to the global vaccine distribution, Dr. Kessler has stated in his written testimony to the committee that the United States has pledged to donate more COVID-19 doses than all of the other countries combined, a whopping 1.2 billion doses worldwide. That effort will provide much needed relief for lower income countries. And I think that's a goal that both of us share on both sides of the aisle. That being said, I've heard concern from one of the vaccine manufacturers, Moderna, about that effort. And I think this point is very important to be made in defense of Moderna's position. Twice in 2021, the Biden administration requested contractual modifications requiring Moderna to accelerate and prioritize deliveries from its U.S. factories to the United States government. These were contractual modifications that were made with the government and with Moderna. My question, I guess, for Dr. Kessler is, how could Moderna have supplied more doses to COVAX under these conditions, sir?
Moderna has the ability to supply the United States and COVAX, in our judgment, with doses that are needed. There's certainly have today, Moderna has that capacity, and we hope that they use it.
Yes, and it appears that they are trying to do that, but given the contractual modifications that they were faced with, those you would agree that that did place additional contractual constraints on them.
Early on, Congressman, you're exactly right. In the months of, I sat there, and the president's position was that it was very important to get Americans the vaccine, and to do that, and also the world. So we've done that. We have plenty of vaccine here. We're donating that. And now it's up to Moderna. And we'll see over the next couple of weeks. We have enough vaccine in the United States. Moderna has significant capacity. I hope the deal between COVAX and Moderna gets signed, and let's see.
I appreciate your response, Doctor. And for everyone, I think the United States, all of us, can be proud of all of the manufacturers, including Moderna and the others, for stepping up in unprecedented times. We can look back now and say maybe things should have been done differently, but I think the United States of America came together, all of us, yourself included, to work towards combating this COVID pandemic. So as we go through this, Madam Chair, and to the committee, I think sometimes we need to laud some of the people and praise them as we continue to move forward, because God forbid if we're ever faced with this situation again, with another pandemic or epidemic, we want private companies to partner with the government to get to our end goal. And with that, I yield back in a great spirit of cooperation. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and I would just say with regard to that, I understand the cooperative relationship between the pharmaceutical companies and the federal government. I just think the pharmaceutical companies, and in this case, Moderna, needs to acknowledge the very serious role that the National Institutes of Health and the government played in getting its product to the market. In fact, they hadn't gotten a product to the market prior to the infusion of both capital and technology that resides with the National Institutes of Health, with the three NIH scientists who co-invented. And so that ought to be acknowledged in a very public way. And they should not, our scientists should not be frozen out of that process. And with that, let me recognize Congresswoman Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony. I want a clarification on a couple of things I've heard. Number one, we keep referring to 2022. So are you telling me that we're going to be masked and vulnerable even into the second half of 2022? Can I get that from each of you really quickly, yes or no? I'll start with you, Doctor. Am I being heard?
Yes, you are, Congressman. Can I just want a clarification? Will we need to be masked and vulnerable from the
Will we
COVID?
still be? Yeah. In the second half of 22, because that's a time of the year that has been mentioned a couple of times in terms of having to do these various things to get us where we need to be. I just am trying to understand my future here.
Congressman, I go to bed every night, and before I go to bed, I mean, I look at the numbers for the day, and I've been asked, one of the hardest jobs I have when I had the opportunity, to brief the president, was to be able to project out where we're going to be in 4 weeks, in 8 weeks, and by the end of 2022. Anyone who tells you they know what we're going to be in 2022, I don't think it's going to be accurate. I think the most important thing is these vaccines, right? I mean,
Are vitally important.
they will prevent hospitalization and death. You
Thank
do
you.
not have to worry if you're vaccinated, right? And as long as you're not immunosuppressed, right? These are protectors. These prevent hospital and death from COVID. That's the key.
So,
and I hope with the antiviral, right? Let's see what the FDA does, right? And I think we're going to have significant quantities of antiviral vaccines plus the antiviral. It's the first time I can sit here and I'm beginning to see a way we can get this under control. Not eliminate, not get rid of the virus entirely, but I think between both. I'm sorry for going on, Congress.
Thank you, Dr. Kessler. I could talk to you for a long time, I'm sure. So if we can't do better on the continent of Africa and in the Caribbean, and even if we are doing better in terms of total vaccinations and boosters, how does that negatively impact our well-being here? I guess I'm gonna give that to Dr. Representative from BARDA,
It's Congressman, this is Gary Disbrow. I can take your question.
Disbrow, Dr. Disbrow, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So, I mean, obviously, until everybody is vaccinated, or the vast majority of the 70% set by the administration, that goal, there are potentials for variants to arise. And so we need to maintain our vigilance, and we need to do everything that we can to make sure that the COVAX commitments are met, that we are working with countries to make sure that their absorptive capacity is increased. So,
hey, Dr. Disbrow, I'm sorry. I want to interfere because I want to ask two quick questions that can be answered by you or anybody. Number one is, how many variants are we monitoring now, and what's happening in countries with regard to those variants, since we're not having access to one of the 3 or 4 vaccines that we're talking about?
Right. So,
and number two is, if we're talking about having there being a vaccine capacity manufacturing presence on the continent of Africa, are we talking about 2021, 2022, 2023? What are we talking about? And those are my 2 questions.
Sure, I can answer your second question first. The commitments by Moderna and BioNTech are in 2022, calendar year 2022. For your first question, there is an interagency group called the SARS-CoV-2 interagency working group, which is made up of experts of subject matter experts from across the federal government who are working with WHO and GEIS to evaluate and monitor different variants of concern, variants of interest, and testing those variants against the monoclonal antibodies that we have, as well as the vaccines that we have.
How many are there? Do you know? It's kind of a round number, how many variants we're tracking, monitoring?
It varies both as variants of concern, but I'm happy to provide that in a written response.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Congressman Klein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank our witnesses and want to thank the committee for working in a bipartisan manner through both the previous administration and this administration to distribute as many vaccines as possible, as many doses as possible through Operation Warp Speed. The development of the vaccine was critical, and its distribution is still ongoing and remains important. Dr. Kessler, Moderna is the only company to pledge not to enforce COVID-19 IP during the pandemic. Do you support this pledge?
Yes.
They've also offered NIH co-ownership, including the ability to license IP covering Moderna scientist inventions made as part of the NIH collaboration. What is the status of that offer?
I will let the lawyers at NIH and Department of Justice who are handling this respond. I am not part of those discussions.
But it's safe to say they're ongoing?
Again, let me defer, if I may, to counsel on negotiations with regard to the patent issues.
Okay, counsel's not testifying today, and so if you could get me that information, that'd be helpful. It's also disappointing that Moderna was not invited to testify today to actually defend themselves against some of the allegations that have been made. Dr. Kessler, at a recent event by Yale Law School titled "How to Vaccinate the World," you stated it would likely take several years to build vaccine facilities in places like South Africa. And further, these facilities wouldn't be ready in time to help with this pandemic. Is that correct?
There's no doubt that building a manufacturing capability will take several years. You know, we've done that, but saying that, it's still very important because we have to prepare for future pandemics. That's why we are working very hard and expect Moderna to be able to work with COVAX to get doses now to low and low middle income countries and to the AU, as well as prepare for the future, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Disbrow, is it true that money that was appropriated in previous COVID-related legislation for BARDA to assist with the development of COVID-specific vaccines was diverted to NIH for other purposes? I think this was referenced in an earlier question.
Yes, so, sir, I would have to check with the Assistant Secretary for Finance and Resources for HHS and provide you that in a written response. BARDA is, appreciative of the funds that this committee has provided to them and the investments that we've made.
Okay. If it comes to, come to find that it was diverted, do you believe it should have been diverted if it stymies the ability of entrepreneurs and others in their efforts to find other solutions besides an injectable vaccine?
So I think it's important that across the U.S. government, we continue to look at other technologies, vaccine technologies. I know there's a vaccine that's being developed that's an oral vaccine, as well as one that's a nasally administered vaccine. And I think those are all important to be, evaluated, especially as we move forward for pandemic preparedness for the future.
I would agree. It's important. And in fact, there are significant complexities involved in manufacturing, storing, and transporting mRNA vaccines. So you would agree that rather than forcing companies to give up their intellectual property, we should be encouraging them to develop other forms, including oral and therapeutics?
So, I mean, we've worked with companies from, all different sectors, and we're happy to have those engagements. We have what is called the market portal, the MCM portal, that companies can submit their ideas, and we have a Corona Watch Tech Watch meeting that if companies are interested in potentially partnering with BARDA, they can make those, they can submit their ideas to us, and we'd be happy to meet with them and have those discussions.
And I understand that the portal exists, but why is it that very little advanced developments for next generation COVID vaccines and therapeutics have gone through BARDA in the past year and a half?
So the funds that we've been provided, are to support the priorities under Operation Warp Speed and now the Countermeasures Acceleration Group for vaccines and therapeutics. We've made key investments to bring those vaccines and therapeutics forward. As Dr. Kessler mentioned, we have multiple vaccines that are available as well as therapeutics, but we have not yet been provided additional resources for advanced research and development at earlier stages.
And it seems to me that the bigger problem isn't that companies aren't sharing their intellectual property or the patent, but there are many other considerations as it relates to making vaccines available around the world. And that's a troubling trend by this administration. Big government solutions, mandates on employers, and a complete disregard for property rights ultimately does more harm than good. So I hope that the Biden administration will reverse course on both of these issues and instead focus on real solutions to the pandemic. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I will I think, is Mr. Molinar back? No. If not, we will move to a second round of questioning, to a second round of 5-minute questioning. I just want to, I think while we acknowledge the role of the pharmaceutical companies, we need to continually acknowledge the role of the National Institutes of Health in and American taxpayers' dollars and the contribution that it makes to developing these vaccines. Let me ask about the donation of domestic excess vaccine. Dr. Kessler, the excess vaccines in the domestic supply, can they be donated, dealing with that before there's expiration dates involved? When I asked this question at an earlier time of USAID, they told me to deal with HHS on this and looking at the chain of custody issues once the vaccine has been distributed. What steps is HHS taking to reduce the number of vaccines going to waste in the United States? And what are the chain of custody challenges to sending the valuable vaccine where it will be administered both domestically and internationally?
Chair DeLauro, thank you very much for that very important question. It's something we spend a lot of both I and my colleagues spend a lot of time on. Number one, what's most important, right, is that the United States will always and only distribute and donate high quality vaccines. There is no difference between a vaccine that we are donating and a vaccine that I would put in my family's arms. So it's quality vaccines across the board. With regard to specifically, we spend a lot of time, dealing with expirations. The good news is, and certainly we've seen and we've been able to work to extend the expiration date. And certainly for example, no Moderna vaccine that, there's no expiration, right, of any vaccine that occurs in our possession. We monitor expiration very carefully and we plan accordingly. Now, you are right that sometimes, and we have seen this, and look, it's been an enormous effort for our state colleagues to do the effort and get everyone who's wanted a vaccine as quickly as possible, vaccines in the arms of American citizens. It's an heroic effort. But you're right, when you distribute vaccines out in the field and they keep on going to certain fields, we are limited by our FDA colleagues correctly that we can't send vaccines, that we can't assure that chain of quality. Right. So there are some, but so we work very carefully to make sure that the states don't order more than they actually need. So we're on top of this, I promise you, Chair DeLauro.
Okay, and that has to do with the international side of that as well, as extending vaccines that are not going to expire in short order, given that in some places the domestic capacity, the international domestic capacity is limited. As if in some countries it's much more limited than it is in the United States. So it is that technical assistance that I think we have to be really focused on as well, to be able to get them distributed at the appropriate time so we're not wasting the vaccine. So thank you. I also, with regard to, let me just ask one question that has to do with our international partners, Dr. Kessler. U.S. has donated 250 million doses, more than all other nations combined. Our other G7, G20 countries fulfilling their pledges for vaccine donations to the low and middle income countries. What is the U.S. doing to pressure other high income countries to meet their pledges and with more urgency?
With your permission, I would ask Director Pace to answer that.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
Director.
Kessler, and thank you, Chair DeLauro. So I'm really glad you asked this. We have really been pressing on this issue ourselves, recognizing it's going to take all of us. As you said, the G7 did make a commitment to sharing vaccines, half of which included U.S. commitments, but the others coming from those countries. And we have not fully seen those realized. It's one of the reasons the president convened those world leaders in September. And at that event, pushed those very countries to come through with their commitments. Following that meeting, and most recently, the Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, convened foreign ministers as well and reiterated that call to action. Since then, we've published, or what has been published is a dashboard of sorts that shows how countries are tracking towards their various commitments. And so it's a very transparent look at how not only the U.S., but these other countries, including the G7, are doing with their commitments to COVAX. So now it's online for the world to see, and we're hoping that that also provides some additional impetus for them to take action.
Okay, thank you. Congressman Cole.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks again to our witnesses. Dr. Kessler, we've talked about lots of ways in which we've tried to help, and it's certainly appropriate to help additional vaccines sent overseas. And some of our companies have offered to build facilities overseas to try and distribute supply. Probably one of the more controversial things is the idea of intellectual property transfer. Do you have any thoughts about that, whether or not that's effective, whether or not that's wise? And frankly, are other countries, because we're not the only vaccines in the world, obviously, there are other countries, are other countries considering transferring intellectual property?
I think that the companies working together, joint strategic partnerships, the voluntary transfer, the voluntary tech transfer, I think we applaud, and we're seeing, for example, Pfizer partner on fill finish in South Africa. There are a whole host of those examples. The world needs these vaccines. No one company can do it. We need that technology shared. We have a lot to do here.
Well, again, there's a difference between companies working together across international lines to meet what we all agree is an incredible need, and us forcing companies, mandating them to share intellectual property. And I just, for the record, I would be very much opposed to that. I don't think that's fair to those companies, and I think it would discourage investment later. That's my personal view. Others may have a different point of view. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that, whether or not that's happening. And again, we're not the only. We don't think they're nearly as effective. And again, you may know more about it. I'm sure you know more about it than I do. And there are Chinese vaccines, there are Russian vaccines, there are other countries that have vaccines of one sort or another. Are they considering transferring intellectual property, to your knowledge? And again, it may not be something that's in your purview even.
I can give you probably the best example, right, that I think we can all applaud and should applaud. We have seen Merck and yesterday Pfizer agree to tech transfer, in essence, to the medicines patent pool with regard to their antivirals. That is enormously important. If these antivirals are as effective as I hope they will be, they're going to be important not only to the United States, right, but they're going to be essential to the world. And generic drugs, I'll let my colleagues, Director Pace and Dr. Dispro add, but the generic availability of these drugs, it took us, Ranking Member Cole, it took us several decades to get this right with HIV. You will remember, the chair will remember, the efforts that we went through in the 1990s, finding those drugs, right? And then spending, a good decade to figure out how to make these available. I think the antivirals that we have now, through really heroic efforts, that we may be able to get on the market here in the United States are going to need to be available around the world, and we're going to need to have generics available. So I think there are tools to do that. I'll let my colleagues comment.
Yeah, so Ranking Member Cole, to answer your question, I am not certain if, the Chinese companies that are developing the vaccines, Sinovac and Sinopharm, are tech transferring their technologies. I think it is important, as Dr. Kessler mentioned, for the companies to tech transfer where they can to expand capacity. But I think it's even more important that we are supporting all of the critical components that are necessary to manufacture additional vaccines. We have to do more than just do tech transfers for drug substance and drug product. We need to make sure that we are expanding capacity for the raw materials, the consumables that are in short supply, the fill finish capacity that was in short supply even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, needles and syringes, which are going to be necessary across the globe, as well as vials. So we are making those investments, and again, appreciate the funding that has been provided by this committee. We are doing that. The primary investments will be here domestically and to onshore those, but they will not only support domestic manufacturing, but our global partners who also need those materials as well.
Yeah, very, very helpful. One quick last question, and directed to you, Dr. Kessler, but again, please feel free to share it around. And I'm just trying to get a clearer, and you may not be in a position to give it, but a clearer view of the level of funding we need to deal with the problem. So what do you anticipate HHS needing, and I mean in dollars, for the global COVID response for the next year? My friend, the chairman, and I will be probably dealing with this at some level when we're negotiating, what's the appropriate level of funding next year. Or I don't know, maybe it's a supplemental. Maybe it takes time to get around this. We all have the same objective here. But I think knowing or having some sense of what the scope of the effort should be is really important in getting it right. So your best judgment now, with the caveat you can revise it when you need to, because I'm sure it's a pretty complex question and a pretty moving target.
And it's a very welcome question, Congressman Cole. I mean, I will take responsibility. I mean, you gave us the resources, and I will tell you, we have put those resources, to very good use. You see that. That's why we have the vaccines we have today. That's reason why we can get our school-age kids. It's because of those resources. But I will tell you, Congressman, I've spent those resources, and we're scratching. Let me let our colleagues, our staffs work together. But it's really because of this committee we got to where we got, and it's not gone without real investment by the American people for both the United States and for the world. And we have spent a lot of dollars, and we are very grateful for that. And if we can work together on that question, I would appreciate it, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's absolutely not a critical question. It's just an informational one to try and get to where we're going. I appreciate what's been done. I think it is an extraordinary effort. I think it's something the country can be proud of, and all of humanity's benefited from. So I think you've used the resources we've given you wisely and well. I'm just trying to get an idea of what we might need going forward. So we'll work on that together. Madam Chair, thank you very much for your indulgence on the time. I'm very grateful. Yield back.
Thank you. Congressman Pocan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to follow up on Ranking Member Cole's question, because that was exactly what I was going to ask, and maybe even a little more specifically to direct your pace. I know from last month's SFOP's hearing, USAID funding is soon to be finished. How how much more money are you going to need before the end of the year to accomplish our goals? And are we going to be seeing an additional request from the White House? Just trying to get a little better idea, because I completely agree with our ranking member. What we've done already has been very important, but I know it's not enough, and you have broader goals than the funding we've given you. I'd like to have a little better understanding what you may need.
Sorry, trying to get myself off mute here. Well, as Dr. Kessler said, we very much appreciate this question. And as he also said, we have fully obligated the funds that we have received, and graciously so. One of the issues that we focused on in this hearing has been the issue of readiness and the fact that we're at this pivot point. And so that truly is a focus of ours moving forward. Not to say we won't keep our foot on the pedal when it comes to sharing, but we still need to be focused on shots in arms and some of the logistical issues, demand generation, and other areas that you flagged for us earlier, Congressman. So that's one way we could use additional resources, or might use additional resources should they be available. We also have a cadre of health attachés around the world who've been working tirelessly on these efforts for longer than I think they expected. And so sometimes we because that's not what's in front of us, we don't realize how much man or woman power is sort of powering this engine to allow us to respond effectively worldwide. And so those are just some examples of what's been working or where we'd like to lean into our work. But obviously we defer to our OMB to present the case more broadly. I suppose the last thing I'll offer is the idea of preparedness and not forgetting that alongside our response. And I know the Vice President made this announcement at the President's Summit about committing $250 million to a financial intermediary fund, and furthermore requesting of Congress another $850 million towards that effort. And so ensuring we have a balance across response and preparedness will be important for us too. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And then one final question for Dr. Disbrow on vaccine access in some difficult places. I know last week the U.S. announced it negotiated a deal to ship additional doses of vaccines like Johnson & Johnson overseas to conflict zones. And Secretary Blinken specifically talked about the need to get that in some of the areas that have humanitarian concerns. Can you talk a little bit about what technology, infrastructure, and human resource investments are needed to deliver those vaccines to humanitarian settings? And can you talk a little more about that J&J deal, please?
Yeah, so I apologize. I'm going to defer to Dr. Kessler, who brought it up in his earlier
I apologize
comments.
if I'm getting the wrong spot. Thank you.
No, David.
Congressman, you're exactly right. This was the first, and just, it may not have been the most doses that we've shipped, but I will tell you, among many of us, my colleagues, it was some of the most meaningful doses to be able to get doses to people for whom no government program has ever gone before. And I want to applaud our colleagues at J&J for working with us, because we talk about donating doses. It sounds simple, but I can tell you the regulatory, legal, all those things are important because of the safety of this. So that humanitarian, to those humanitarian centers, just absolutely critical and very important.
And is there anything on the actual delivery side you can share with us, specifically more information on this J&J deal? I know you said it may be smaller than we'd like, but still extremely significant that this is happening. Can you just share a little more on the details?
No, the only reason I said smaller than that we would like is we tend to talk in tens of millions and billions of doses, and here every 10,000, 100 is a big deal. That I'm not minimizing. These are this is. I will get you the delivery schedule if I can. If I could submit that to you, I'll get you the delivery schedule.
I'd love to see that. I'd yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fleischman, Congressman Fleischman.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. And to Dr. Kessler, Director Pace, and Director Disbrow, thank you for your testimonies today and for your very good and candid, informative answers to the committee's questions. As we're all appropriators today, and our oversight questions are so important, not only to the committee, but to the Congress, but to the American people. So I thank you. I want to touch on a couple of issues that we've touched on before, but really just for clarification purposes more than anything. Dr. Kessler, do you fear that there is a lack of infrastructure that would safely support independent vaccine manufacturing and distribution in some of these other countries in which we want to help their citizens?
I'll let Director Pace, comment in a second. I do recognize, sir, that, getting vaccines delivered is only part, of the equation. Right? I think I mentioned, I spent a decade chairing the board of the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. That some of you will remember, Elizabeth, that foundation was started for U.S. because of her kids, becoming infected, and we moved globally very early on, to be able to get doses, to low and low middle income countries. That technical assistance, that capacity, that absorption, that uptake. Again, we have more to do on supply, but I think your question is absolutely key with regard to that kind of technical assistance with regard to that uptake. Director Pace, please correct me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kessler. I want to draw on something Dr. Disbrow said earlier about the sort of spectrum of needs and technical assistance when it comes to manufacturing capacity in some of these countries, and clarify our sense that it's not only building some of these facilities, if you will, or hubs from scratch, but there's some existing infrastructure there and some capacity on which we might be able to build the various investments the U.S. government is making. And so in addition to some of the other examples my colleagues have offered, our Development Finance Corporation, working with the Department of Health and some of our health attachés in places like India and South Africa, have identified those locales to sort of, again, build on existing capacity in a way that can accelerate us getting to scale. I'm not sure if Dr. Disbrow has more to add, or if you, Congressman, have additional questions.
So in addition to that, Director Pace, your question is a great question. So it's more than just the facilities. You also have to make sure that you have trained people who can, work in the facilities. And so in some of the countries where they may have not had the experience of manufacturing vaccines and sterile injectables, you really need to make sure that you have that. They become very, once they're trained, other companies want to take them away and use them because training and making sure that those individuals are available is very difficult. But it's more than just the facility. It's also making sure that you have the people and the infrastructure to support it.
I sincerely appreciate all three of your answers to clarify that for the committee. In closing, I would like to say this to everyone involved. It's my hope that these conversations progress in a way that will provide for a solution that continues our humanitarian work while staying sensitive to the protections and the liabilities of U.S. companies. As you know, I'm a champion for the free enterprise system. I think all of the companies involved have done a very laudatory job stepping up at a time of crisis, coming together, working with the government to accomplish the goal of defeating COVID, both nationally and internationally. So with that, I thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and what I will do is to just, I just want to ask one question, and then we'll close. If the gentleman would just bear with me, because we need the two of us to continue. I think we're the only two left, but I will make my case here. I will submit for the record questions that have to do with vaccine equity to you, Ms. Pace. I would love to know about the antivirals, Dr. Disbrow, and I'll get this question to you about how BARDA contributed to that development. To you, Dr. Kessler, about our negotiations with Pfizer or others are using the Defense Production Act for us to up our production in order we have 20, while we pledged $1.1 billion, 1.1 billion doses, only 226 million doses have been shipped, 20%. And Pfizer is producing the 1 billion. So what is it that we can do to accelerate the pace? And I know that people are working very, very hard at this, but I will submit those questions. And if I might just close, and I want to just say a thank you to you, Dr. Kessler, Dr. Pace, Dr. Disbrow. I think we covered important topics today. I would make one, it would be my hope that we could move on our appropriations bills for 2022, because locked within those bills at the moment are serious, very, very serious resources for the areas that you cover and for the issues attached to this discussion that would be very, very helpful in your being able to further and continue your work. A couple of points here. The virus exposed a number of our shortcomings in our preparedness, but also our interconnectedness with the world. And so COVID is not just a domestic challenge, it's a global challenge. And the United States needs to contribute to that solution, and we are working at that. But the longer COVID is allowed to spread, it becomes a breeding ground for new variants that may be more transmissible and that could evade, or a current vaccine. So not enough vaccine in the world now. Limited vaccine needs to be better. That includes providing as much vaccine as quickly as possible to other countries. We must also support the efforts to accelerate manufacturing capacity, and that's a conversation with BARDA to maximize vaccine access and equity as soon as possible. We've had the discussion about facilitating tech transfer sooner rather than later because of the, in some ways, the lack of capacity that some of these countries have, and we have this capacity, but they don't, and we need to help them with that effort. I would urge you to explore every avenue to continue to exert pressure on those companies that were supported with U.S. taxpayer dollars to accelerate production and distribution of the vaccine. I know some of the companies have been excellent partners. I commend them for their leadership. I would find it unconscionable for any company to make billions in profits without doing everything in its power to reach the most needy throughout the world. It's not just a moral imperative to ensure the health and safety of billions of people. It is in our nation's national security interest to bring this pandemic to a close as rapidly as possible to save lives. And we have the power to do that, I might add. And a final note, it is my hope, and I know that this is not your bailiwick, I'm sure you'll refer me to USTR, but that we do have a ministerial meeting on the 30th of this month, where the issue of the temporary transfer of intellectual property, and I emphasize the word temporary transfer of that intellectual property will be the point of discussion. And I want to commend the work that the United States has done already in this area at the last TRIPS meeting, and my optimism for what we will do at the ministerial on the 30th. I just say, all in all, it is so much within our power here in the U.S. To be able to deal with these issues. I thank you for your work, for your life's work, and for what you are doing for all of us now, what you're doing for our country, and what you're doing internationally. Thank you so much for being with us.